There's nothing that cuts deeper than being rejected by the one person who promised to love you forever. Sometimes the cruelest betrayal happens right when you're at your most vulnerable, dressed in white and believing in dreams. In a small chapel in Bitter Ridge, Thomas Brandt shoved his bride Lily May aside on their wedding day, calling her scarred face shameful. She fell to the ground in her wedding dress while everyone watched. But sitting in the back was Colt Danner, a wealthy rancher who saw everything. He walked up slow, lifted Lily into his arms, and carried her out of that chapel. What happens when a broken woman meets a man who sees beauty where others see flaws? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The scar that changed everything had been carved into Lily May's left cheek when she was 7 years old. Not by malice or cruelty, but by a moment's carelessness that would shadow every day of her life thereafter. She'd been playing near her father's blacksmith shop, chasing a calico kitten that had wandered too close to the forge. The kitten darted between her legs. She stumbled, and her face met the red-hot poker that her father had carelessly left leaning against the anvil. The burn had healed, but it left behind a raised, puckered line that ran from her left temple down to the corner of her mouth. Her mother, God rest her soul, had tried everything. Salves made from prairie herbs, store-bought ointments from traveling medicine men, even a visit to the doctor in Cheyenne when they could scrape together the train fare. Nothing worked. The scar remained, a constant reminder that some wounds never fully heal. Bitter Ridge was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone's business, and Lily May's business had become her face. Folks were kind enough in their way. They didn't stare outright, and the church ladies always included her in their sewing circles. But she saw the pity in their eyes, heard the whispered conversations that stopped when she entered a room. "Poor thing," they'd say. "Such a sweet girl, if only." The sentence never needed finishing. Everyone understood what came after, "if only." Her father, Samuel Porter, was a good man worn down by life's disappointments. After her mother died of consumption when Lily was 15, he'd thrown himself into his work, hammering out horseshoes and farming implements with a fury that spoke of grief he couldn't voice. He loved his daughter fiercely, but love couldn't change the reality of their situation. In Bitter Ridge, unmarried women had few options, and scarred unmarried women had even fewer. That's why when Thomas Brandt first showed interest, Samuel Porter had nearly wept with relief. Thomas was everything a father could want for his daughter, at least on paper. 26 years old, educated back east at some fancy school, and heir to the Brandt banking fortune. His father, Cornelius Brandt, owned the only bank within 50 miles and had his fingers in half the businesses in 3 counties. The Brandts lived in the finest house in Bitter Ridge, a 2-story Victorian with gingerbread trim and stained glass windows that caught the morning light like jewels. Thomas had returned from Boston the previous spring, full of ideas about modernizing his father's business and bringing culture to what he called this frontier backwater. He was handsome in a soft, pampered way, smooth hands that had never known real work, clothes that always looked freshly pressed, hair pomaded into perfect waves. The unmarried women of Bitter Ridge had practically lined up to catch his attention. So when he'd begun paying calls on Lily May Porter, the whole town had buzzed with speculation. Some said it was charity, others whispered about hidden debts between the families. But Lily had dared to hope it might be something more. Thomas was unfailingly polite during their chaperoned visits, bringing her books of poetry and small gifts from his travels. He spoke of his plans for the future, of building something lasting and important. When he looked at her, he focused on her eyes, never letting his gaze drift to her scar. "You have an interesting mind, Miss Porter," he'd said during one of their evening walks. "Most women here can only discuss recipes and gossip. You actually think about the world beyond this place." It was true. Lily had always been a reader, devouring every book she could borrow from the traveling peddlers or the small collection kept in the church basement. She dreamed of places beyond the prairie, of cities with theaters and museums, of conversations about ideas instead of weather and crops. Thomas seemed to offer a glimpse of that larger world. The courtship lasted 6 months. By Bitter Ridge standards, it was practically a whirlwind romance. Samuel Porter had given his blessing eagerly, and even Cornelius Brandt had seemed pleased with the arrangement. "Good breeding stock," he'd said approvingly, as if discussing cattle rather than his son's future wife. "Hardy frontier girls make the best wives." But there was another man in Bitter Ridge who watched the courtship unfold with quiet interest, though few noticed his attention. Colt Danner rarely came to town except for supplies, and when he did, he kept to himself. His ranch lay 15 miles north of Bitter Ridge, sprawling across some of the finest grazing land in the territory. Folks said he owned more cattle than any man had a right to, and his beef brought top dollar in Denver and Kansas City. Colt was a mystery that the town had long given up trying to solve. He'd arrived 5 years earlier with more money than anyone had seen in these parts, bought up 3 struggling ranches, and set about building an empire. He was maybe 35, though his weathered face made it hard to tell. Tall and lean, with dark hair, touched by premature silver at the temples and eyes the color of storm clouds. He dressed well, but practically. Quality leather and wool that could stand up to honest work. What made Colt Danner truly mysterious wasn't his wealth or his past, though both generated plenty of speculation. It was the deep sadness that seemed to follow him like a shadow. He was polite to everyone, generous with his business, and fair in his dealings, but there was a distance in his manner, as if he was looking at the world through glass. The town's matchmaking mothers had tried to interest him in their daughters, but he declined all invitations with such gentle courtesy that no one could take offense. Some said he'd lost a wife back east. Others claimed he was running from something, the law maybe, or just a past too painful to remember. The truth was simpler and more complicated than any of the rumors. Colt Danner had indeed loved and lost, but not in the way people imagined. He'd loved the idea of home, of family, of belonging somewhere. But every time he'd reached for it, life had snatched it away. His interest in Lily Mae Porter had begun the first time he'd seen her in town. She'd been outside the general store, helping an elderly woman load her purchases into a wagon. The kindness in her manner, the patience she showed, it had caught his attention in a way that mere beauty never could. Over the months that followed, he'd found himself timing his trips to town to coincide with her errands. Never approaching, never intruding, just watching from a respectful distance. He'd seen how Thomas Brandt treated her during their courtship. The subtle condescension, the way his smile never quite reached his eyes when he looked at her. Colt had done business with the Brandts long enough to know their measure. They valued appearance above substance, profit above people. Young Thomas was cut from the same cloth, perhaps even worse for his Eastern education that had taught him to disguise his disdain with pretty words. But what could Colt do? He had no claim on Lily Mae Porter, no right to interfere in her happiness. If she chose Thomas Brandt, that was her choice to make. All he could do was hope that perhaps he was wrong, that perhaps Thomas truly cared for the woman beneath the scar. The wedding had been planned for the last Saturday in September, when the heat of summer had broken but before the first hard frost. Lily had spent weeks preparing, sewing her dress by lamplight and dreaming of the life that lay ahead. The whole town would attend. In Bitter Ridge, weddings were social events that brought everyone together regardless of their feelings about the bride and groom. The dress itself was a work of art, born of love and hope. Lily had saved every penny from her sewing work to buy the fabric, ivory silk from a traveling merchant who claimed it had come all the way from China. She'd spent countless hours stitching delicate lace trim and tiny pearl buttons, creating something beautiful enough for a princess. When she looked at herself in the mirror on her wedding morning, for just a moment, she almost forgot about the scar. The veil her grandmother had worn, yellowed with age but still graceful, softened the harsh line and made her feel like the bride she'd always dreamed of being. The Bitter Ridge Chapel was small but pretty, with wooden pews that Samuel Porter had helped to build and windows that cast colorful patterns on the floor when the sun was right. Reverend McKnight had officiated at every wedding in town for the past 15 years, and his kind voice had a way of making even the most nervous couples feel at peace. Lily had always imagined standing before him, promising to love and cherish someone who would promise the same in return. As she walked down the aisle that September morning, her father's arm steady beneath her hand, Lily had felt a flutter of nervousness in her stomach. But it was the good kind of nervousness, the kind that comes with new beginnings and fresh hope. The chapel was full. She could see Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house, the Petersons who ran the general store, even some of the cowboys from the outlying ranches who'd cleaned up for the occasion. Thomas waited at the altar in his finest suit, his hair perfectly groomed and his posture straight as a fence post. His father stood beside him, chest puffed with pride at his son's successful match. The Brandt family had spared no expense for the occasion. There would be a reception at their house afterward, with a real orchestra brought in from Denver and enough food to feed half the territory. But as Lily reached the front of the chapel and lifted her eyes to meet Thomas's gaze, she saw something that made her blood run cold. There was no love there, no warmth, no joy at seeing his bride. Instead, there was something closer to disgust, quickly masked but unmistakable to someone who had spent a lifetime reading faces for signs of revulsion. In the back pew, unnoticed by almost everyone, Colt Danner sat with his hat in his hands and worry in his heart. He'd come because he couldn't stay away, drawn by a need to see this through even if it meant watching the woman he'd come to care for marry another man. But something in the atmosphere of the chapel felt wrong. A tension that had nothing to do with normal wedding nerves. The ceremony began with Reverend McKnight's familiar words about love and commitment, about the sacred bond between husband and wife. But as the minutes passed, Thomas's discomfort became more and more apparent. He fidgeted with his cufflinks, avoided Lily's eyes, and when the time came for them to clasp hands, his touch was cold and reluctant. That's when young Billy Watkins, the banker's messenger, came running through the chapel doors with a yellow telegram clutched in his sweaty fist. The yellow telegram seemed to burn in Billy Watkins's hand as he stumbled down the chapel aisle, his boots echoing against the wooden floor like gunshots in the sudden silence. Every head turned toward the interruption, and Reverend McKnight paused mid-sentence, his Bible still open to the passage about love being patient and kind. "Mr. Brandt, sir," Billy gasped, his face flushed red from running. "This came urgent from Denver. The sender said it couldn't wait." Thomas's face went white as fresh snow. He snatched the telegram with shaking fingers, his eyes scanning the brief lines of text. As he read, his expression changed from confusion to shock to something darker, a cold fury that transformed his features into something Lily had never seen before. Cornelius Brandt stepped forward, concern creasing his brow. "Son, what is it?" Thomas crumpled the telegram in his fist, but not before several people in the front pews caught a glimpse of the words printed there. Mrs. Henderson, whose eyesight was sharp as a hawk's despite her 70 years, would later tell anyone who'd listen what she'd seen. Lily Mae Porter, worked Dance Hall Denver Spring 1882, stop thought you should know, stop. The silence in the chapel stretched like a taut rope, ready to snap. Lily stared at Thomas, confusion and dawning fear warring in her chest. She had indeed been to Denver that spring. Her Aunt Margaret had taken ill, and Lily had gone to care for her. She'd worked in her aunt's boarding house, serving meals and cleaning rooms to help pay for medicine. But the way Thomas was looking at her now, as if she'd committed some unforgivable sin. "Is this true?" Thomas's voice cut through the silence like a blade. He held up the crumpled telegram, his hand trembling with rage. Did you work in a dance hall in Denver? Lily's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. The accusation was so far from the truth, so impossible to comprehend, that she couldn't find words. I know, Thomas. I worked in my aunt's boarding house. Liar. The word exploded from him with such venom that several women in the front pews gasped. You deceived me. You deceived all of us, standing there in that white dress like some innocent when you're nothing but a... Thomas, please, Lily whispered, tears beginning to blur her vision. Let me explain. But Thomas was beyond listening. The months of suppressed disgust, the pressure from his father to marry well, the fear that his Boston friends would laugh at his frontier bride. It all came pouring out in a torrent of cruelty that shocked even those who knew him best. Look at you, he snarled, his face twisted with contempt. That scar should have been warning enough. Damaged goods, inside and out. Did you really think I could stomach touching you? Kissing that ruined face? I was willing to overlook your appearance for the sake of respectability, but this... He waved the telegram like evidence in a trial. I won't be made a fool of by some scarred whore. The collective gasp from the congregation was audible, but it was nothing compared to the sound that escaped Lily's throat, a broken cry that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. The words hit her like physical blows, each one designed to wound, to destroy, to reduce her to nothing. Before she could steady herself, before she could find her balance or her voice, Thomas placed his hand on her shoulder and shoved. Hard. Lily stumbled backward, her heel catching in the long train of her wedding dress. She fell in a cascade of ivory silken lace, hitting the wooden steps of the altar with a sound that would haunt the dreams of everyone present. Her veil tore free, drifting down like a broken promise to settle beside her on the floor. The chapel erupted in shocked murmurs and horrified whispers. Some women began to weep. Several men half rose from their seats, uncertain whether to intervene or retreat. Reverend McKnight stood frozen, his faith in human decency temporarily shattered by the cruelty he'd just witnessed. Thomas straightened his jacket and turned to address the congregation, his voice carrying the cold authority he'd learned in his father's bank. I apologize for the deception that has been practiced upon us all. This woman is not fit to be any man's wife, let alone mine. This ceremony is concluded. He strode past Lily's fallen form without a second glance, his father hurrying after him, muttering apologies to the assembled guests. The chapel filled with confused chatter as people began to rise, some rushing to Lily's aid, others following the Brandts toward the exit. But before anyone could reach her, before the shame and humiliation could fully register, a shadow fell across Lily's prone form. She looked up through her tears to see a man kneeling beside her. Not Thomas, not her father, not any of the well-meaning church ladies, but Colt Danner. He didn't speak at first, just studied her face with those storm-gray eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. Then, with movements as gentle as if he were handling a wounded bird, he slipped one arm beneath her shoulders and another beneath her knees. "I've got you," he said quietly, his voice meant for her alone. "I've got you." As he lifted her from the floor, Lily felt something she hadn't expected. Safety. Despite the humiliation, despite the pain of Thomas's words, despite the fact that her entire world had just crumbled around her, she felt safe in this stranger's arms. Colt carried her down the chapel aisle with measured steps, ignoring the stares and whispers that followed in their wake. Some folks stepped aside respectfully, others craned their necks to get a better look at this unexpected development. But Colt's attention was focused entirely on the woman in his arms who had stopped crying but was trembling like a leaf in a storm. "Where?" Lily started to ask, but Colt shook his head gently. "Nowhere you don't want to go," he said. "My ranch, if you'll have it, or back to your father's house. Your choice, entirely." The simple offer of choice, After Thomas had stripped away her dignity, her future, her sense of self, nearly broke her again. But there was something in Colt's manner, something in the careful way he held her, that gave her strength. "Your ranch," she whispered. "Please." As they reached the chapel doors, Colt paused. Lily could see her father pushing through the crowd, his face a mask of anguish and rage. Samuel Porter was a gentle man, but the sight of his daughter's humiliation had awakened something fierce in him. "Papa," Lily called softly, and Samuel reached them just as they emerged into the bright September sunlight. "My girl," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. "My poor girl. I should have seen. I should have known." "This isn't your fault," Lily said firmly, finding strength she didn't know she possessed. "None of this is your fault." Samuel looked at Colt, taking in the careful way he held Lily, the protective stance of his shoulders. "You'll take care of her?" "With my life," Colt answered without hesitation. And as they climbed into Colt's wagon, leaving behind the ruins of what was supposed to be the happiest day of her life, Lily Mae Porter felt the first stirring of something she'd thought was lost forever: hope. The telegram that had destroyed her world lay forgotten in the chapel, trampled under the feet of the departing guests. But the lie it contained would follow them all, a poison that would take time and truth to overcome. For now, though, it was enough that she was no longer alone, no longer broken on the floor of her shattered dreams. As the wagon pulled away from Bitter Ridge, carrying her toward an uncertain but somehow promising future, Lily didn't look back. The life she'd planned was over, but perhaps, just perhaps, something better was beginning. The Danner ranch spread across the horizon like a promise of permanence in a world that had just proven how quickly everything could change. As Colt's wagon crested the final hill, Lily caught her first glimpse of what would become her sanctuary. Rolling pastures dotted with cattle stretched in every direction, bounded by split-rail fences that spoke of careful planning and honest work. In the distance, the Rocky Mountains rose like ancient guardians, their peaks touched with early snow that caught the afternoon light. The main house sat in a grove of cottonwoods beside a clear-running creek, a two-story structure built of native stone and timber that seemed to grow from the land itself. It wasn't as grand as the Brandt mansion in town, but it had something the banker's house had always lacked: a sense of belonging, as if it had been waiting here for generations for the right people to call it home. Smoke rose from the chimney, and Lily could see horses in the corral and men working near the barn. Everything about the place spoke of prosperity, earned through hard work rather than inherited privilege. This was a working ranch, built by someone who understood the value of both land and labor. Colt helped her down from the wagon with the same careful attention he'd shown in the chapel, his hands steady and respectful. Lily's wedding dress, torn and stained now, rustled around her feet like the remnants of broken dreams. She was acutely aware of how she must look, a scarred woman in a ruined gown, carrying nothing but shame and confusion. "Maria!" Colt called toward the house, and a woman emerged from the kitchen door. She was perhaps 50, with iron-gray hair pulled back in a practical bun, and the kind of face that had seen enough of life's hardships to respond with wisdom rather than judgment. Her dark eyes took in Lily's condition without a flicker of surprise or condemnation. "Bring her inside," Maria said simply, as if broken brides appeared on their doorstep every day. "I'll heat water for a bath." The interior of the house was as welcoming as its exterior promised. The front room was furnished with well-made pieces that looked comfortable rather than fashionable. Leather chairs worn soft by use, a stone fireplace with a mantel that held books instead of fancy ornaments, and windows that framed the magnificent view like living paintings. Everything was clean and orderly, but lived in, a far cry from the museum-like perfection of the Brandt home. "This is Maria Santos," Colt said, his hand hovering protectively near Lily's elbow without actually touching her. "She's been keeping this place running since long before I arrived. Maria, this is Miss Lily Mae Porter." Maria's weathered hands were gentle as she took Lily's arm. Come, child. Let's get you out of that dress and into something more comfortable. There will be time for explanations later. As Maria led her up the stairs, Lily heard Colt's voice behind them. The blue room, Maria. It has the best light. The blue room was indeed beautiful, with windows facing both east and south that would catch the morning sun and afternoon warmth. A brass bed was covered with a quilt in shades of blue and white, and a small writing desk sat beneath one window. Fresh wild flowers in a mason jar suggested that someone had prepared this room with care. Mr. Colt had me ready this room yesterday, Maria said, noticing Lily's questioning look. He said we might have a guest. The implication of those words, that Colt had somehow anticipated this disaster, had prepared for it, was too much for Lily to process. She sank into the chair by the window, her legs suddenly too weak to support her. "I don't understand any of this," she whispered. "Why would he do such a thing? Thomas, I mean. That telegram, the things it said. None of it was true." Maria began unlacing the back of Lily's dress with practiced efficiency. "Truth and lies are strange things," she said quietly. "Sometimes a lie can reveal more truth than an honest word ever could." "What do you mean?" "That young man showed you who he really was today. Better to learn it now than after years of marriage to a man who would treat his wife with such cruelty." As the wedding dress fell away, Lily felt as if she was shedding more than just fabric. The dreams and illusions that had sustained her for months seemed to fall with it, leaving her feeling strangely lighter despite the pain. Maria helped her into a warm bath, the first luxury she'd known in her simple life. As she sank into the heated water, Lily felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. For the first time since the telegram had arrived, she could think clearly. "Maria," she said hesitantly, "may I ask you something?" "Of course, child." "Why is Mr. Danner helping me? He doesn't even know me." Maria was quiet for a long moment, washing Lily's hair with soap that smelled of lavender. "Mr. Colt is a good man who has known his share of pain. Perhaps he recognizes it in others." "Has he ever been married?" "No." The single word carried weight, as if there were stories Maria wasn't ready to share. "But he has loved and lost. We all have, in our way." After the bath, Maria provided Lily with a simple day dress in soft blue cotton that fit reasonably well. It was plain but well made, the kind of dress a respectable woman might wear for everyday tasks. As Lily looked at herself in the mirror, she was startled to realize that she looked normal. Not like a ruined bride, not like a woman who had just endured public humiliation, but simply like herself. When they came downstairs, they found Colt in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up and hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. He'd changed from his town clothes into work pants and a cotton shirt, and somehow the transformation made him seem more approachable, less intimidating. "Feeling better?" he asked, rising as they entered. "Yes, thank you. Mr. Danner, I need to—" "Colt," he interrupted gently. "Just Colt." Colt. The name felt strange on her tongue, intimate in a way that surprised her. "I need to understand why you're helping me. You don't owe me anything. We barely know each other." Colt was quiet for a moment, studying her face with those penetrating gray eyes. "Do you know what I see when I look at you, Lily May?" She touched her scar reflexively. "The same thing everyone sees. I see a woman who spent 6 months being courted by a man who was clearly uncomfortable in her presence, yet never once complained or demanded to know why. I see someone who helped old Mrs. Henderson load her wagon every week without being asked, who always had a kind word for the children in town, even when their mothers whispered behind her back. I see strength that most people mistake for weakness, and beauty that has nothing to do with scars or the lack thereof." The quiet conviction in his voice made Lily's chest tight with emotion. "You've been watching me." "I have," he admitted without shame, "and I've been waiting for someone to see what I see. When it became clear that Thomas Brandt, Never would. Well, perhaps it's better this way. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, painting the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Through the kitchen window, Lily could see the ranch hands heading in from their work, tired but satisfied with their day's labor. This was a world built on honest effort and mutual respect, so different from the social calculations and hidden cruelties of town life. "I can't stay here," Lily said quietly, though part of her desperately wanted to. "People will talk." "Let them talk," Colt replied. "You're welcome here as long as you need sanctuary. Maria will act as chaperone, and there are other women on the neighboring ranches. Your reputation will be protected." "And what about your reputation?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I stopped worrying about what people thought of me years ago. The question is, what do you want, Lily May? Not what's expected of you, not what's proper or safe, but what do you actually want?" It was a question no one had ever asked her before, and she found herself without an immediate answer. What did she want? For the first time in her life, the choice was entirely hers to make. 3 days into her stay at the Danner Ranch, Lily May discovered something unexpected about herself. She was useful. Not decoratively useful like the fine china that sat untouched in her father's cabinet, but genuinely, practically useful in ways that made a real difference in the daily workings of a large ranch. It began when she came downstairs on her second morning to find Maria struggling with the breakfast preparations for 12 hungry ranch hands. The older woman was clearly fighting a bad spell with her arthritis, her movements careful and pained as she tried to manage the massive cast-iron skillet that fed the crew. "Let me help," Lily said, tying one of Maria's aprons around her waist. It was blue gingham, faded soft from countless washings, and it felt more natural than any fine dress she'd ever worn. "You don't need to," Maria began, but Lily was already at her elbow, taking the heavy pan with steady hands. "I've been cooking for my father since I was 12, Lily said simply. "I know my way around a kitchen." What followed was a revelation for both women. Lily didn't just know how to cook. She had an intuitive understanding of food that went beyond mere recipes. She could judge the doneness of biscuits by their smell, knew exactly how much salt the gravy needed by its color, and had a gift for stretching provisions that made Maria nod with approval. By the time the ranch hands filed in for breakfast, the table was laden with perfectly fluffy biscuits, thick slabs of bacon, scrambled eggs that weren't the least bit rubbery, and gravy that made strong men sigh with contentment. The cowboys, initially wary of the presence of a lady in their dining space, quickly warmed to Lily when they realized she could produce meals that actually improved their quality of life. "Miss Lily," said Jake Morrison, the ranch foreman, as he reached for his third biscuit. "I don't know what happened to bring you here, but I hope you decide to stay." Jake was a weathered man in his 50s, with the kind of deep tan that came from decades of outdoor work and hands scarred from handling rope and leather. He'd been Colt's first hire when the boss had bought the ranch, and his loyalty was absolute. If Jake approved of someone, the rest of the crew would follow his lead. "These are the finest biscuits I've had since my grandmother passed," added Tom Fletcher, a younger cowboy whose shy smile revealed that he was half in love with any woman who could cook like this. Lily felt a flush of pride that had nothing to do with compliments on her appearance and everything to do with genuine appreciation for her skills. She'd always been a good cook, but in her father's house, meals were simple affairs, just the two of them eating whatever she could manage with their limited supplies. Here, cooking for a dozen hard-working men who genuinely appreciated good food, she felt a sense of purpose she'd never experienced before. Colt came in just as the men were finishing their breakfast, his hair still damp from washing at the pump outside. He moved with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own domain, exchanging brief words with his workers about the day's plans. But Lily noticed how his eyes sought her out across the room, checking to ensure she was settling in well. "Boys," he said, settling into his chair at the head of the long table, "Miss Lily will be staying with us for a while. I expect you to treat her with the respect due any lady." There were murmurs of agreement, but also something more. Genuine warmth. These men had already decided they liked her, not because they'd been ordered to, but because she'd earned their regard through her actions. After breakfast, as Lily helped Maria clear the dishes, the older woman watched her with thoughtful eyes. "You have a gift," she said finally. "Not just for cooking, but for making people feel cared for. It's a rare thing." "I enjoy it," Lily admitted. "I always have. At home, I only cooked for Papa, and he's not much for conversation over meals. This is different." "Better?" Lily considered the question as she dried a plate with one of Maria's carefully mended dish towels. "Yes, much better." That afternoon, Colt found her in the kitchen garden behind the house, examining the late-season vegetables with a critical eye. The garden was functional rather than beautiful. Rows of practical crops like potatoes, carrots, and winter squash that would help feed the ranch through the cold months ahead. "Maria planted this in the spring," he said, joining her among the neat rows. "But she's getting too old to maintain it properly." Lily knelt beside a row of carrots, her fingers testing the soil. "The drainage isn't quite right here, and these beans could use better support." She looked up at him, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. "If you don't mind me saying so." "I don't mind at all. In fact, I was hoping you might take an interest in it. Maria's been worrying about next year's growing season." "I could help," Lily said, then caught herself. "That is, if I'm still here in the spring." Colt crouched beside her, close enough that she could smell the clean scent of soap and sunshine that clung to his clothes. "That's entirely up to you, Lily, but I hope you'll consider it. This place could use a woman's touch, not for decoration, but for the practical wisdom that makes a house into a home." There was something in his voice, a carefully controlled longing that made Lily's heart skip. She'd grown up thinking that her only value lay in her potential as a wife and mother, that her domestic skills were merely preparation for that eventual role. But here was a man suggesting that her abilities had worth in their own right, that she could contribute to this thriving enterprise not as an ornament, but as a partner. "I've never lived anywhere but Bitter Ridge," she said quietly. "I don't know if I'd be any good at ranch life." "You've been here 3 days," Colt replied. "Already the men are talking about how much better the meals are. Maria's arthritis isn't keeping her up at night because you've taken the burden off her hands. And yesterday I saw you mending Tom Fletcher's shirt without being asked. If that's not ranch life, I don't know what is." That evening, as Lily sat on the front porch watching the sun set over the mountains, she reflected on how much had changed in just a few days. The humiliation of her wedding day felt like something that had happened to someone else, a nightmare from which she'd finally awakened. Here, surrounded by people who valued her for what she could do rather than what she looked like, she was beginning to remember who she was beneath the weight of other people's expectations. Maria joined her on the porch, settling into the rocking chair beside her with a soft grunt. "Penny for your thoughts, child." "I was thinking," Lily said slowly, "that I've never felt so useful in my life." "Is that strange?" "Not strange at all," Maria replied. "Sometimes it takes losing everything we thought we wanted to discover what we actually need." Inside the house, they could hear Colt moving around his study, the soft sound of papers rustling as he worked on the ranch's books. It was a peaceful sound, the kind that spoke of a life built on solid foundations rather than shifting sand. For the first time since the telegram had arrived, Lily May Porter began to believe that her story might not be ending. It might just be beginning. The first real test of Lily's place at the Danner Ranch came on a crisp October morning when 3 neighboring women arrived unannounced, ostensibly to deliver preserves, but actually to satisfy their curiosity about the scandalous situation everyone was whispering about. Lily was kneading bread dough in the kitchen when she heard the sound of a wagon approaching, and her stomach clenched with familiar anxiety. Through the window, she recognized Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield from the Double W Ranch, Mrs. Sarah Beth Carlson, whose husband owned the spread to the east, and Mrs. Victoria Price, whose family controlled the largest cattle operation in the county after Colt's. These were the matriarchs of the ranching community, women whose approval or disapproval could make or break a person's standing in the territory. "Company coming," Maria murmured, appearing at Lily's shoulder. "Best get that flour off your hands." But Lily surprised them both by continuing to work the dough with steady hands. "Let them see me as I am," she said quietly. "If they can't accept that, then their opinion isn't worth having." The women knocked on the front door with the authority of people accustomed to being welcomed everywhere, and Maria went to receive them while Lily finished shaping her loaves. She could hear the formal pleasantries being exchanged, the careful probing disguised as neighborly concern. "We brought apple butter," Mrs. Whitfield was saying, her voice carrying the tone of someone bestowing a great favor. "Made it myself from the last of the season's apples." "How thoughtful," Maria replied with perfect politeness. "Miss Lily will appreciate it. She's been doing such wonderful work in our kitchen." There was a moment of pointed silence, and Lily knew they were waiting to see if she would appear to receive their charity personally. She dusted the flour from her hands, smoothed her apron, and walked into the front room with her chin held high. The three women studied her with the intensity of buyers examining livestock at auction. Mrs. Whitfield, a stern woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled into a severe bun, spoke first. "Miss Porter, we heard about your situation. How unfortunate." "Mrs. Whitfield," Lily replied evenly. "Mrs. Carlson, Mrs. Price, thank you for coming." Mrs. Carlson, younger and softer-featured but no less formidable, leaned forward with false sympathy. "My dear, we simply had to check on you. The whole territory is talking about what happened at your wedding. Such a terrible shock it must have been." Lily recognized the fishing expedition for what it was. These women wanted details they could carry back to their social circles, intimate knowledge of her humiliation that they could parcel out in carefully measured portions to their friends. "It was indeed shocking," Lily said calmly, "though perhaps not in the way most people think." Mrs. Price, the youngest of the three but arguably the most influential due to her family's wealth, raised an eyebrow. "Oh? How so?" "I was shocked to discover how little I really knew Thomas Brandt's character. It's fortunate that his true nature revealed itself before we were legally bound together." The women exchanged glances. This wasn't the broken, shame-faced creature they'd expected to find. This was a woman who seemed almost relieved rather than devastated. "And your arrangement here?" Mrs. Whitfield asked delicately. "People are wondering about the propriety." "Mrs. Santos serves as an excellent chaperone," Lily interrupted smoothly, "and I'm grateful for Mr. Danner's Christian charity in providing sanctuary during my time of need." It was perfectly proper language that gave them no ammunition for gossip, but Mrs. Carlson wasn't ready to give up so easily. "Still, dear, you must be anxious to return to your father's house. A young woman living on a bachelor's ranch, even with a chaperone, well, tongues will wag." Before Lily could respond, the sound of boots on the porch announced Colt's arrival. He entered through the front door, hat in hand, and surveyed the gathering with polite but guarded eyes. "Ladies," he said, nodding to each in turn, "what brings you to the Danner Ranch today?" "We came to check on Miss Porter," Mrs. Price said, her tone taking on a different quality in the presence of the territory's most eligible bachelor. "To offer our support during her difficult time." Colt's smile was perfectly courteous and completely cold. "How kind of you. I trust you found Miss Lily in good health and spirits." "Indeed," Mrs. Whitfield replied carefully, "though we were just discussing the delicacy of her situation." "Were you?" Colt's voice carried just enough edge to make all three women shift uncomfortably. "How thoughtful. Perhaps you'd like to join us for coffee. Miss Lily's coffee is quite exceptional. better than anything you'll find in Denver." It was a masterful deflection, transforming their investigative mission into a social call, while simultaneously highlighting Lily's domestic competence. The women found themselves accepting the offer almost against their will. In the kitchen, Lily prepared the coffee service with the kind of attention to detail that would have done credit to a hotel. She arranged Maria's best china on a silver tray, added fresh cream and sugar, and included some of the molasses cookies she'd baked that morning. Everything was perfect, from the temperature of the coffee to the delicate lace doily under the sugar bowl. As she served the women in the front parlor, Lily noticed how their attitudes began to shift. The coffee was indeed exceptional, the cookies were clearly made by someone who understood baking, and the service was flawless. These were women who valued domestic competence above almost anything else, and Lily was demonstrating mastery that commanded respect. "This coffee is remarkable," Mrs. Carlson admitted reluctantly. "What's your secret?" "I grind the beans fresh each morning," Lily explained, "and I add just a pinch of salt to bring out the flavor. My grandmother taught me that trick." "Ingenious," Mrs. Price murmured, clearly making mental notes. Colt watched the interaction with something approaching amusement. "Miss Lily has improved our entire operation," he said. "The men's morale has never been higher, and we're saving money on provisions because she knows how to make everything stretch further." It was a subtle but important point. Lily wasn't just a charity case taking up space. She was contributing real value to the ranch's success. As the afternoon wore on, the women's initial hostility gradually gave way to grudging respect and then genuine interest. They began asking Lily's opinions on domestic matters, seeking her advice on difficult recipes and household management challenges. By the time they prepared to leave, the dynamic had completely transformed. "You must come to our harvest dinner next month," Mrs. Whitfield said as they gathered their wraps. "Sarah Beth, you should ask her about that bread recipe." After they left, Lily sank into a chair with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The encounter had been draining, but she sensed it had been crucial for her future in the territory. "You handled them perfectly," Maria said with obvious pride. "Those women came here expecting to find a fallen woman to pity or judge. Instead, they found someone they can't ignore." Colt appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed. "You've just passed the most important test this territory has to offer," he said. "If Eleanor Whitfield approves of you, everyone else will follow her lead." That evening, as Lily worked on mending clothes by lamplight, she reflected on how different her life had become. Just weeks ago, she'd been focused on winning Thomas Brandt's approval, on making herself into whatever he wanted her to be. Now she was discovering her own strength, her own worth, and, perhaps most surprisingly, her own voice. The woman who had fallen in the chapel of that September day was gone forever. In her place was someone stronger, someone who knew her own value and wasn't afraid to claim it. The November afternoon was crisp with the promise of winter when Lily found herself alone with Colt for the first time since her arrival at the ranch. Maria had gone to town for supplies, and the ranch hands were out checking the herd before the evening feeding. Lily was in the study, carefully transcribing Colt's handwritten notes about cattle purchases into a ledger with neat, precise script. She'd discovered this talent by accident the week before when Colt had mentioned struggling with the ranch's bookkeeping. His handwriting, while strong and masculine, wasn't suited to the detailed record-keeping that running a large operation required. Lily's years of helping her father with his blacksmith accounts had taught her the value of clear, organized records. "You have beautiful handwriting," Colt said, appearing in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee. He'd taken to bringing her refreshment during these afternoon work sessions, a small kindness that had become a treasured routine. "Thank you," Lily replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "My mother insisted on proper penmanship. She said a lady's handwriting was a reflection of her character." Colt settled into the chair across from the desk, studying her as she worked. "What else did your mother teach you?" It was a question that touched on territory they'd never explored before. In the weeks since her arrival, their conversations had focused on practical matters. Ranch business, daily routines, safe topics that didn't venture into the deeper waters of personal history. "She taught me to see beauty in small things," Lily said after a moment's consideration. "The way light hits dewdrops on spider webs, the sound of rain on the roof, the satisfaction of bread rising perfectly in the oven. She said that happiness wasn't something that happened to you, but something you created through paying attention to the world around you." Wise woman. How old were you when she passed? 15. Lily's pen paused over the ledger. Old enough to remember her clearly, young enough to still need her desperately. Colt was quiet for a long moment, and when Lily looked up, she saw something in his expression that she recognized, the particular sadness that came from losing someone too soon. "My mother died when I was 12, he said quietly. "Cholera epidemic swept through our town in Missouri. Took her and my younger sister both." "I'm sorry," Lily said, meaning it deeply. "That must have been terrible for your father." "It destroyed him." Colt's voice carried old pain. "He started drinking heavily, lost the farm within 2 years. I ended up in an orphanage in St. Louis until I was old enough to make my own way." The revelation explained so much about the man sitting across from her. The self-reliance, the careful emotional distance, the way he seemed to hold himself apart even while being genuinely kind. Lily felt honored that he'd shared something so personal with her. "How did you come to have all this?" she asked, gesturing toward the window that framed the vast expanse of his ranch. Colt's expression grew complicated. "That's a longer story. The short version is that I got lucky in some business dealings, saved my money, and headed west when I heard about land opening up out here." There was more to it, Lily sensed, but she didn't press. Everyone was entitled to their private sorrows and triumphs. "What about you?" Colt asked. "Did you always dream of leaving Bitter Ridge?" "I used to," Lily admitted. "When I was younger, I'd read books about cities like San Francisco and New York, and I'd imagine myself in those places. But after Mama died, Papa needed me. And then, well, I stopped thinking much about dreams that seemed impossible." "What made them seem impossible?" Lily touched her scar unconsciously. "People like me don't get to have grand adventures. We're grateful for whatever small happiness comes our way." The words were out before she could stop them, revealing more about her self-perception than she'd intended. Colt leaned forward, his gray eyes intense. "People like you," he repeated. "What exactly does that mean?" "Scarred, plain, practical rather than pretty. Is that truly how you see yourself?" The question was asked so gently, with such genuine curiosity, that Lily found herself considering it seriously, rather than deflecting with a self-deprecating joke. "It's how everyone else sees me," she said finally. "After a while, it becomes how you see yourself." Colt stood and walked to the window, hands clasped behind his back. "When I look at you, Lily, I see someone who transformed the atmosphere of this entire ranch within days of arriving. I see a woman who can take a kitchen full of basic ingredients and create meals that make hard-working men feel appreciated and cared for. I see someone who faced public humiliation with more dignity than most people could muster, who turned a devastating betrayal into an opportunity for growth." He turned back to face her, his expression earnest. "I see intelligence, kindness, strength, and yes, beauty. Real beauty, the kind that comes from character rather than chance." Lily's hand trembled slightly as she set down her pen. "Colt, I know it's too soon," he said quickly. "I know you need time to heal from what Thomas Brandt did to you, but I want you to know that when you're ready, if you're ever ready, I'd be honored to court you properly." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Lily stared at him, her heart racing with a mixture of fear and something that might have been hope. "You don't know everything about me," she said carefully. "That telegram, even though the specific accusation was false, it's true that I'm not the innocent maiden Thomas thought he was marrying. I've seen things, heard things, lived through things that proper ladies aren't supposed to experience. Such as, when I went to Denver to care for my aunt, I worked in her boarding house. It wasn't a respectable establishment. Not what that telegram claimed, but not the kind of place where sheltered young women usually work. I served meals to men who'd been drinking, cleaned up after fights, listened to stories that would shock the church ladies back home." Colt studied her face carefully. "And what did you learn from those experiences?" "That the world is more complicated than Bitterridge would have you believe. That good and bad aren't always as clear-cut as people pretend. That sometimes decent people end up in difficult circumstances, through no fault of their own. Those sound like valuable lessons to me. You're not shocked?" A smile tugged at the corner of Colt's mouth. "Lily, I've been places and done things that would probably shock you just as much. The difference between us and people like Thomas Brandt isn't that we're perfect. It's that we've learned from our experiences instead of being broken by them." Outside, the wind was picking up, rattling the windows and promising a cold night ahead. But inside the study, with the lamp casting warm circles of light and Colt's steady presence filling the room, Lily felt safer and more valued than she ever had in her life. "I need time," she said finally, "to figure out who I am when I'm not trying to be what someone else wants me to be." "Take all the time you need," Colt replied. "I'll be here when you're ready." As evening fell and they prepared to rejoin the practical rhythms of ranch life, Lily realized that for the first time since her mother's death, she was allowing herself to imagine a future built on her own choices, rather than other people's expectations. The letter arrived on a gray December morning, carried by a rider who'd pushed hard through the early snow to reach the Danner ranch. Lily was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when she heard the urgent knock at the front door, followed by the low murmur of serious conversation between Colt and the messenger. When Colt entered the kitchen a few minutes later, his face was pale and his jaw set in the hard line she'd learned to recognize as barely controlled anger. He held an envelope in his hand, the paper expensive and bearing the distinctive letterhead of Cornelius Brandt's bank. "What is it?" Lily asked, though part of her already knew this letter would change everything, just as that telegram had months before. Colt handed her the envelope without a word. Her name was written across the front in Thomas Brandt's familiar handwriting, but underneath it, someone had scrawled in different ink, "Urgent legal matter, must respond immediately." With trembling fingers, Lily broke the seal and unfolded the thick paper. What she read made her legs weak enough that she had to grip the edge of the kitchen table for support. "Miss Porter," the letter began with cold formality. "Recent developments require your immediate attention regarding matters of mutual concern. My father's investigation into the circumstances surrounding our failed wedding ceremony has revealed information that materially affects your current situation. We have discovered that the telegram received on our wedding day, while containing false specific allegations, was sent by someone with intimate knowledge of your recent activities. More concerning, we have learned that your present residence at the Danner Ranch is part of a deliberate scheme to defraud our family of rightful compensation. Our attorneys have determined that your public accusations of abandonment and false witness constitute grounds for a substantial claim against your reputation and, by extension, your current protector's assets. Unless you return immediately to your father's house and sign the enclosed documents acknowledging sole responsibility for the failed wedding and its associated costs, we will have no choice but to pursue legal action against both you and Mr. Danner. The expenses incurred for our wedding, catering, musicians, flowers, and preparations totaled nearly $3,000. Additionally, my reputation has suffered considerable damage due to the public nature of the incident and the subsequent gossip linking my name with scandal. We believe compensation of $5,000 would adequately address these concerns. You have 1 week to comply with this demand. Failure to do so will result in immediate legal action that will likely cost Mr. Danner his ranch and leave you destitute. I trust you will see the wisdom in resolving this matter quickly and quietly. Thomas Brandt, Esquire. The letter fluttered from Lily's numb fingers to the kitchen floor. She stared at Colt, whose face had darkened with each word he'd read over her shoulder. "This is impossible," she whispered. "They're claiming I'm responsible for their wedding expenses? That I somehow planned this whole thing?" "It's a shakedown," Colt said flatly, his voice tight with controlled fury. "Pure and simple extortion dressed up in legal language." Maria, who had been quietly tending to the stove, turned around with fire in her dark eyes. "That family has more money than they know what to do with. This isn't about expenses. It's about revenge." Lily bent to retrieve the letter, reading it again with growing horror. $5,000. "Colt, that's more money than most people see in a lifetime," Colt finished grimly. "Which is exactly why they chose that amount. They know I'd have to sell the ranch to pay it." "But it's not true." "None of it is true. Truth doesn't always matter in court," Colt said, beginning to pace the length of the kitchen like a caged animal, especially when you're facing lawyers with unlimited resources and judges who might be sympathetic to prominent banking families. The implications crashed over Lily like a cold wave. Everything she'd built here, everything she'd begun to hope for, was being threatened by the same man who had already destroyed her once. But this time, it wasn't just her own future at stake. It was Colt's life work, Maria's home, the livelihoods of all the ranch hands who depended on this place for their survival. "I have to go back," she said quietly. "I have to sign their papers." "Like hell you will." Colt's voice cracked like a whip. "I won't let them force you into anything. Don't you see? This is exactly what they want, to destroy you because you helped me. I won't be responsible for that." But as Lily spoke, a memory surfaced from her time in Denver, something she'd pushed to the back of her mind because it had seemed unimportant at the time. She'd been working late one evening in her aunt's boarding house when she'd overheard a conversation between two men in the downstairs parlor. One of them had been asking detailed questions about her, where she was from, how long she'd been in Denver, whether she had any male visitors. At the time, she'd assumed it was just the kind of idle curiosity that strangers in boarding houses sometimes showed about each other. But now, thinking back on it with new understanding, she realized the questions had been far too specific, too purposeful. "There's something else," she said slowly, her mind racing as pieces of a puzzle began to fall into place. "When I was in Denver, there was a man asking questions about me. I thought it was just curiosity, but what if someone was already investigating me then? What if this whole thing was planned from the beginning?" Colt stopped pacing. "What kind of questions?" "About my background, my family, whether I had any romantic attachments. He even asked my aunt how long I planned to stay." "When was this?" 2 weeks before I came home. Before Thomas even started courting me seriously." The silence that followed was broken only by the crackling of the fire and the soft whistle of wind around the house eaves. But Lily could practically hear the wheels turning in Colt's mind. "This doesn't make sense," Maria said finally. "Why would the Brandts investigate you before the courtship? Unless the courtship itself was part of the plan," Colt finished, his voice hard as granite. "Think about it. Thomas shows up with a sudden interest in a woman he'd never paid attention to before. He courts her just long enough to get her hopes up, then destroys her publicly on their wedding day. But the real target was never Lily. It was me." Lily stared at him. "Why would they want to target you?" "Because I own the water rights to Devil's Creek, and Devil's Creek runs through the best grazing land in 3 counties. Cornelius Brandt has been trying to buy those rights for years, but I've always refused. If he could force me to sell this ranch." The pieces clicked into place with horrible clarity. The Brandts had never intended for the wedding to succeed. They'd orchestrated the entire courtship as an elaborate trap, knowing that Thomas's public rejection would create scandal and that Lily would need sanctuary. They'd probably been counting on her father taking her in, which would have left the scandal to die down naturally. But Colt's intervention had given them something better, a direct way to attack his finances and force him to sell. "The telegram," Lily breathed. "They sent it themselves. They knew exactly when to have it delivered for maximum impact. And now they're trying to finish what they started," Colt said grimly. "If I'm forced to sell to pay their fabricated lawsuit, Cornelius gets the water rights and the best ranch land in the territory." Lily felt sick. She'd been nothing more than a pawn in a game she'd never even known was being played. Her humiliation, her broken dreams, her public disgrace, all of it had been calculated moves in someone else's chess match. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "This is all my fault. If I'd never—" "No." Colt's voice was fierce. "This is not your fault. You were to stand guard, how to watch for the signs, how to fight when fighting was necessary and show mercy when it was possible." Will had grown stronger, more confident, his connection to the upside down fading to a dull awareness instead of an open wound. He'd started drawing again, not the visions of shadow and decay that had haunted him, but landscapes of light, portraits of his friends, scenes from campaigns where heroes won and nobody had to die. Mike stayed close to him, as protective as ever, and together they'd begun planning their future beyond Hawkins. College in California, maybe, where the sun was warm and the dark couldn't reach them. Lucas and Max had become inseparable, two survivors who'd learned that love meant showing up even when you were terrified, meant holding on when everything tried to tear you apart. They'd taught Hellboy that courage wasn't fearlessness. It was being afraid and doing it anyway. Erica had appointed herself Hellboy's unofficial manager, organizing his schedule and making sure he didn't forget the important things like Mike's campaign nights or the Wheelers' awkward family dinners that Joyce insisted he attend because you're part of this community now, and that means suffering through casseroles like the rest of us. Steve and Nancy had found an equilibrium after years of circling each other, not quite together, but not quite separate, bonded by shared trauma and the understanding that some relationships were more important than romance. They'd both been accepted to good schools, Steve to a teaching program that surprised everyone except Robin, Nancy to journalism at Columbia that surprised no one. And they'd made Hellboy promise to visit, to not disappear into the dark again just because Hawkins was safe. "You're stuck with us," Steve had said, grinning. "Forever. That's the price of saving the world. You have to stick around for the boring parts, too." Eddie had recovered fully from his upside-down injuries, though the scars remained, and he'd embraced his role as town freak with renewed enthusiasm. His band had written a song about the battle called The Red Demon's Waltz that was equal parts metal and surprisingly tender, and he dedicated it to the guy who proved that monsters are just misunderstood heroes with better aesthetics. Robin had found her confidence, her voice, her place in the world, and she'd made it her personal mission to ensure Hellboy understood modern slang, pop culture, and why The Breakfast Club was the greatest movie ever made, even if he thought it was just kids sitting in a library talking. "You're basically the Bender of this group," she'd explained. "The misunderstood rebel who acts tough but secretly cares way too much." Dustin had maintained the cross-dimensional communication equipment even though the gate was sealed, insisting that you never know when we might need it, and I'm not taking chances after everything we've been through. He'd also started documenting their findings. All prime grazing land, all with water rights. Colt looked up from the letter he was composing. And all legally acquired through what appears to be legitimate business dealings. On paper, the Brandts look like savvy investors taking advantage of unfortunate circumstances. But when you see the pattern, it's systematic theft, Maria finished, entering the study with a tray of coffee and sandwiches. The older woman had become their unofficial strategist, her sharp mind and decades of experience providing insights that neither Lily nor Colt would have considered alone. The question is, how do we prove it? Lily asked, accepting the coffee gratefully. She'd been working since dawn, her usual morning routine of cooking for the ranch hands abbreviated so she could focus on their legal research. We don't have to prove the conspiracy, Colt said thoughtfully. We just have to prove that their specific claims against us are false. If we can do that publicly enough, it might encourage some of these other victims to come forward. That afternoon, their second breakthrough arrived in the form of a travel-stained rider carrying a response to one of the many letters Colt had sent out over the past few days. This one came from Denver, from a private investigator named Samuel Hayes, whom Colt had contacted through business associates in the cattle trade. Hayes had been thorough in his investigation of Lily's time in Denver, and his report vindicated her completely. Not only had she worked in a respectable boarding house caring for her sick aunt, but she'd earned the praise of everyone who'd known her there. The investigator had even tracked down the man who'd been asking questions about her, a known associate of Thomas Brandt, who'd been paid to gather compromising information. They couldn't find any real scandal, Colt said, scanning the detective's report, so they decided to manufacture one. But the most damaging revelation came in the report's final paragraphs. The investigator had discovered that Thomas Brandt had a gambling problem that his family had been covering up for years. He owed substantial debts to several unsavory characters in Denver and Kansas City, debts that his father had repeatedly paid to avoid scandal. The pressure to marry well and settle down hadn't come from romantic inclination. It had been a desperate attempt to rehabilitate his image and access his trust fund, which was tied to marriage and respectability. This is why he was so angry, Lily realized, pieces of the puzzle clicking into place, not just because of the telegram, but because marrying me was supposed to solve his problems. When the scandal broke, he lost access to his inheritance and probably faced pressure from his creditors. Which means he's even more desperate now than he was then, Maria pointed out. Desperate men do foolish things. Their planning session was interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected visitor. Tom Fletcher, the youngest of the ranch hands, came running into the house with news that sent a chill through all of them. "Boss," Tom panted, his face flushed from cold and exertion. "You need to know, there's strangers been asking questions in town. 3 men, well-dressed, claiming to be lawyers. They're staying at the hotel and talking to anybody who'll listen about Miss Lily and the situation out here." Colt's jaw tightened. "What kind of questions?" "About Miss Lily's reputation, about whether she's been, Tom glanced apologetically at Lily. "About whether she's been proper since she's been here. They're offering money for information, making it sound like they're trying to help her somehow." "Building their case," Colt said grimly, "or trying to manufacture witnesses to support their claims." Lily felt the familiar flutter of panic in her chest, but it was different this time. Instead of the helpless terror she'd experienced in the chapel, this was the sharp, focused fear of someone preparing for battle. "What do we do?" she asked. Colt stood and walked to the window, staring out at the snow-covered landscape that represented everything he'd worked to build. "We accelerate our timeline. I was hoping to have more evidence before we made our move, but if they're actively trying to corrupt potential witnesses, we can't wait." "What kind of move?" Maria asked. a public one. Colt turned back to face them, his expression resolute. The Brandts are counting on being able to control the narrative, to paint this as a simple matter of a wronged family seeking compensation. But if we can present our evidence in the right forum, we can turn their own tactics against them. Over the next 24 hours, their plan took shape with a kind of precision that spoke to Colt's business acumen and Lily's growing strategic thinking. They would not simply defend against the Brandts' accusations. They would go on the offensive. The key was the territorial governor's winter reception, scheduled for the following weekend in Cheyenne. It was the social event of the season, attended by every person of importance in the territory, including judges, legislators, newspaper editors, and, yes, the Brandt family. It would be the perfect venue to present their evidence publicly and force a confrontation that the Brandts couldn't control or manipulate. "It's risky," Colt admitted as they refined their strategy. "If this backfires, we'll have made enemies of some very powerful people." "They're already our enemies," Lily pointed out. "At least this way, we're fighting back on our own terms." The plan required careful orchestration. Jake Morrison would travel to Cheyenne ahead of them, carrying copies of their evidence to the Territorial Attorney General's office and select newspaper editors. Maria would coordinate with their allies among the ranching families, ensuring that supportive voices would be present at the reception. And Lily would attend. The reception as Colt's partner, presenting herself not as a victim seeking sympathy, but as a woman of substance who refused to be intimidated by threats and lies. "Are you sure about this?" Colt asked her on the evening before their departure. They were alone in the study, the fire crackling softly as they made final preparations for what might be the most important confrontation of their lives. "I'm terrified," Lily admitted honestly. "But I'm also angry, and I'm tired of running from other people's lies. If we're going to build a life together, and I think we are, then I want it built on truth, not on hiding from the past." Colt reached across the desk and took her hand, his fingers warm and steady around hers. "Whatever happens, we face it together." "Together," Lily agreed. And for the first time since that terrible day in the chapel, she felt truly ready to fight for her future. The dress Maria helped her pack for the reception was a deep blue silk that brought out her eyes and complemented her dark hair. It wasn't as elaborate as her ruined wedding gown, but it was elegant and dignified, the dress of a woman who knew her own worth. As Lily folded it carefully into a traveling case, she thought about how much had changed since she'd last dressed up for a formal occasion. That woman in white lace had been hoping to please, hoping to be accepted, hoping to find safety through someone else's protection. The woman who would wear blue silk to the governor's reception was different, stronger, more certain of herself, ready to stand as an equal partner rather than a dependent. Outside, snow continued to fall, but inside the ranch house, there was a sense of purpose and determination that no winter storm could dampen. Tomorrow, they would travel to Cheyenne and face their enemies in the most public way possible. Tonight, they made their final preparations for war. The governor's mansion in Cheyenne sparkled with the kind of opulence that reminded everyone present of the territory's growing importance and prosperity. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over polished floors, where the elite of Wyoming territory gathered in their finest attire, the men in black evening wear and the women in silk gowns that rustled like whispered secrets as they moved through the grand ballroom. Lily entered on Colt's arm, her deep blue dress elegant in its simplicity, her dark hair arranged in a style that was fashionable without being ostentatious. She'd chosen her jewelry carefully, her mother's pearl earrings and a simple gold chain that had belonged to her grandmother. Nothing flashy, nothing that could be criticized as inappropriate or pretentious. The reaction to their arrival was immediate and electric. Conversations paused mid-sentence as heads turned to take in the sight of the territory's most eligible bachelor, escorting the woman who had been at the center of the season's most scandalous gossip. Some faces showed curiosity, others disapproval, but most revealed the kind of avid interest that promised the evening's entertainment had just walked through the door. "Steady," Colt murmured, his arm solid and reassuring beneath her gloved hand. "Remember, we belong here just as much as anyone else." Lily lifted her chin and smiled with genuine warmth at the familiar faces in the crowd, Mrs. Whitfield, Mrs. Carlson, and Mrs. Price, who had all made the journey from their ranches for this prestigious event. The three women approached almost immediately, their expressions carefully neutral, but their eyes bright with curiosity. "Miss Porter," Mrs. Whitfield said with formal politeness, "how lovely to see you again. You look quite recovered from your recent difficulties." "Thank you, Mrs. Whitfield. I feel very well indeed." Lily's voice was steady, confident. "Mr. Danner has been kindness itself, and I've found ranch life quite agreeable." It was a perfectly proper response that gave nothing away while establishing her current status. She was neither a fallen woman seeking charity nor a victim requiring pity. She was simply a lady attending a social function with her escort. Across the ballroom, she could see the Brandt family holding court near the elaborate refreshment table. Cornelius Brandt, resplendent in expensive evening wear, was engaged in animated conversation with several men Lily recognized as prominent territorial officials. Thomas stood slightly apart, his posture rigid with tension that was visible even across the crowded room. He looked thinner than she remembered, his face bearing the hollow-eyed appearance of a man under considerable strain. "They've seen us," Colt observed quietly. Indeed, Thomas had spotted them and was speaking urgently to his father, who turned to examine Lily and Colt with the calculating gaze of a predator assessing potential threats. Even at a distance, Lily could feel the weight of Cornelius Brandt's attention, and she understood why so many people had found themselves outmaneuvered by this man over the years. "Good," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. "Let them wonder what we're planning." The next hour passed in a carefully choreographed dance of social interaction. Lily and Colt moved through the crowd, greeting acquaintances, making polite conversation, and gradually positioning themselves near the key figures they needed to reach. Jake Morrison had done his work well. Several newspaper editors were present and clearly aware that something significant was about to unfold. The Territorial Attorney General, a sharp-eyed man named William Crawford, made his way over to their small group during a lull in the evening's musical entertainment. "Mr. Danner," Crawford said with formal courtesy. "Miss Porter, I understand there may be some legal matters of mutual interest that we should discuss." "Indeed there are," Colt replied, "though perhaps this evening is not the appropriate time for such weighty subjects." Crawford's smile was thin but knowing. "Of course. Though I find it interesting how often personal matters become public concerns when they involve questions of justice and fair dealing." It was a carefully worded hint that Crawford had received and reviewed the evidence Jake had delivered earlier in the week. The Attorney General was positioning himself carefully, showing interest without committing to any particular course of action until he could see how events unfolded. As if summoned by some invisible signal, Cornelius Brandt began making his way across the ballroom toward their group. His progress was measured and deliberate, allowing time for conversations to pause and attention to focus on the approaching confrontation that everyone in the room could sense coming. Thomas followed in his father's wake, his face pale but his jaw set with the kind of desperate determination that comes from having no good options left. Behind them came several other men, lawyers, Lily realized, recognizable by their expensive clothes and predatory expressions. The crowd began to form a loose circle around the two groups, drawn by the magnetic pull of impending drama. Governor Hoyt himself paused in his conversation with territorial legislators to observe the proceedings, his experienced political instincts recognizing a moment that might have significant ramifications. Cornelius Brandt stopped just outside comfortable conversation distance, close enough to be heard clearly, but far enough away to maintain the pretense of civil discourse. His smile was cold and confident, the expression of a man who had maneuvered many opponents into positions of weakness and expected this evening to follow familiar patterns. "Miss Porter," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the suddenly quiet ballroom. "How unexpected to see you here. I trust you received our correspondence regarding the resolution of certain outstanding matters." The silence that followed Cornelius Brandt's words stretched across the ballroom like a held breath. Every person present understood they were witnessing more than social pleasantries. This was the opening move in a very public chess match where the stakes were measured in fortunes and reputations. Lily felt the familiar flutter of anxiety in her chest, but this time it was accompanied by something stronger, a cold, clear anger that steadied her voice and straightened her spine. She had spent too many months being afraid of these people, too many nights wondering what she had done to deserve their cruelty. Now she knew the truth, and the truth was armor. "Indeed, we did receive your correspondence, Mr. Brandt," she replied, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed ballroom. "Though I must confess, we found it quite illuminating in ways you perhaps did not intend." A murmur rippled through the crowd. This was not the response of a cowed woman seeking to avoid scandal. This was a direct challenge, delivered with the kind of quiet confidence that commanded attention. Cornelius Brandt's smile faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean, Miss Porter. We simply sought to resolve an unfortunate situation in a manner that would spare all parties further embarrassment. By demanding $5,000 in compensation for a wedding that your son deliberately sabotaged." Colt's voice cut through the air like a blade. "For expenses incurred in a ceremony that was designed to fail from the very beginning." The crowd's murmur grew louder. This was no longer a private dispute. It was a public accusation of fraud, delivered in front of the territory's most influential citizens. Thomas Brandt stepped forward, his face flushed with anger and desperation. "That's a lie. You have no proof of any such thing." "Don't we?" Lily asked calmly, and nodded to Jake Morrison, who had been waiting near the edge of the crowd with a leather portfolio in his hands. As Jake approached, Lily continued speaking, her voice steady and clear. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for bringing private matters into this distinguished gathering, but when powerful people abuse their position to destroy innocent lives, sometimes public exposure is the only remedy available." Jake handed her the portfolio, and Lily opened it to reveal the carefully organized documentation they had spent the past week assembling. "Mr. Crawford," she said, addressing the Territorial Attorney General directly, "perhaps you would be interested in reviewing evidence of a systematic conspiracy to defraud property owners throughout this territory." Crawford stepped forward, his professional interest clearly piqued. "What sort of evidence?" "Documentation showing 17 ranches forced into bankruptcy through manufactured legal crises over the past 2 years," Colt said, taking up the narrative seamlessly. "All subsequently purchased at below-market prices by a consortium represented by Brandt Banking. All possessing valuable water rights that are now controlled by the same consortium." The crowd was no longer murmuring. They were listening with the intense focus of people who recognized that careers and fortunes might hang in the balance of the next few minutes. Cornelius Brandt's face had gone white, but his voice remained controlled. "These are wild accusations without foundation. Miss Porter is clearly desperate to avoid responsibility for her own deceptions." "What deceptions would those be?" Lily interrupted, her voice cutting through his bluster. "The fictional scandal alleged in the telegram that mysteriously arrived on my wedding day, the same telegram that was composed and sent by an associate of your son, who was paid to investigate me in Denver." She pulled another document from the portfolio. "Or perhaps you're referring to the deception involved in your son's courtship itself. The courtship undertaken not from affection, but as part of a calculated plan to create scandal that could be used to attack Mr. Danner's property." Thomas Brandt made a strangled sound of protest, but Lily continued relentlessly. We have statements from witnesses in Denver who remember the man asking questions about me weeks before your son ever declared his interest. We have documentation of payments made to that same investigator, and we have records of your son's gambling debts, debts that marriage and access to his trust fund were meant to resolve. The revelations hit the crowd like physical blows. Mrs. Whitfield's expression had shifted from curiosity to outrage. Governor Hoyt was listening with the sharp attention of a man calculating political implications. Several of the newspaper editors present were taking notes with barely concealed excitement. But it was Thomas himself who provided the final, damning piece of evidence. Cornered, desperate, and faced with the collapse of everything he'd hoped to achieve, he lost control entirely. "You don't understand," he burst out, his voice cracking with strain. "I had no choice. The debts, they were going to kill me if I didn't." He stopped abruptly, realizing he had just confessed to the entire gathering. The silence that followed was deafening. Crawford stepped forward, his expression grim. "Mr. Brandt, I think we need to have a private conversation about these allegations, and about the attempted extortion of Mr. Danner and Miss Porter." As territorial officials moved to surround the Brandt family and their lawyers, Lily felt a strange sense of lightness, as if a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying had suddenly been lifted from her shoulders. The truth was finally out, and with it came something she had never dared to hope for. Vindication, delivered not through charity or pity, but through her own courage and the strength she had found in standing with someone who truly saw her worth. 6 months later, on a warm June morning when the prairie grass waved like green silk in the wind and the Rocky Mountains stood sentinel against a cloudless sky, Lily Danner stood in her kitchen garden watching her husband teach their new ranch hand the proper way to mend fence posts. The young man, barely 18 and eager to prove himself, listened with the kind of intense attention that Colt's quiet authority naturally commanded. The kitchen garden itself was a testament to the changes that had transformed the Danner Ranch since that snowy December confrontation in Cheyenne. What had once been Maria's practical but modest plot had expanded into terraced beds that produced enough vegetables not only to feed the ranch crew, but to supply several families in Bitter Ridge whose own gardens had failed. Lily's instinctive understanding of soil and seasons, combined with her organizational skills, had created something that was both beautiful and bountiful. The wedding had taken place in April, in the same chapel where her dreams had once been, shattered. But this time, the bride who walked down the aisle wore a dress of soft ivory silk that complemented rather than concealed her scar, and the groom who waited at the altar looked at her with eyes full of love and admiration. Reverend McKnight, who had officiated with tears of joy in his eyes, had pronounced them husband and wife before a congregation that included not only the ranch families, but several of the property owners who had reclaimed their land after the Brandt conspiracy was exposed. The aftermath of that dramatic evening at the governor's reception had unfolded with the kind of swift justice that sometimes emerges when powerful people realize they've been caught in criminal behavior by equally powerful witnesses. Cornelius Brandt had attempted to bluster his way through the initial investigation, but when 14 of the 17 defrauded ranchers came forward with their own evidence of manipulation and fraud, the territorial attorney general had moved decisively. Thomas Brandt was currently serving a 2-year sentence for fraud and extortion, his gambling debts and desperate attempts to cover them having led him into criminal behavior that his father's money couldn't fix. Cornelius himself had avoided prison time through a plea agreement that required him to make full restitution to his victims and surrender his banking license. The Brandt financial empire had crumbled within weeks, their assets liquidated to pay damages that ultimately totaled more than $50,000. But for Lily, the most satisfying result hadn't been the Brandt's downfall. It had been the restoration of her own reputation and the validation of her worth as a person. The territorial newspapers had covered the story extensively, painting her not as a victim, but as a heroine who had helped expose corruption and protect other families from similar attacks. Marriage proposals had arrived from as far away as California, from men who admired her courage and integrity, though by then her heart belonged entirely to the quiet rancher who had seen her value from the very beginning. "Mrs. Danner," called a familiar voice from the front of the house, and Lily looked up to see Mrs. Whitfield approaching through the garden gate. The older woman had become one of Lily's closest allies in the months since the confrontation, her sharp intelligence and social influence proving invaluable in rebuilding the community bonds that the Brandt's schemes had damaged. "Eleanor," Lily said warmly, using the first name that had been offered as a mark of genuine friendship rather than mere politeness. "Perfect timing. I just pulled the first tomatoes of the season." "Wonderful. I came to discuss the plans for the territorial fair next month. The organizing committee wants you to enter your preserves in the competition, and Sarah Beth insists that your bread recipe deserves a blue ribbon." Lily smiled, wiping her earth-stained hands on her apron. The same blue gingham apron she'd worn that first morning when she'd discovered her talent for feeding hungry ranch hands. It had become something of a symbol for her, representing not just her domestic skills, but her ability to nourish and care for the people around her. "I'll consider it," she said, "though I think Maria deserves more credit than I do for teaching me her techniques." "Nonsense," Eleanor replied briskly. "Maria's a fine cook, but you have a gift for making people feel valued and cared for. That's not technique. That's character." As they discussed the fair preparations, Lily reflected on how much her life had changed since that terrible September day when she'd fallen in her wedding dress before a shocked congregation. The woman she'd been then, anxious to please, grateful for any scrap of affection, convinced that her scar made her unworthy of real love, felt like a stranger now. The woman she'd become understood that true beauty came from strength, kindness, and the courage to fight for what was right. She'd learned that love wasn't about becoming what someone else wanted, but about being valued for who you truly were. And she discovered that sometimes the most devastating betrayals could lead to the most unexpected blessings. That evening, as Lily and Colt sat on their front porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, she felt the deep contentment that comes from a life built on solid foundations. In her lap, she held a letter from her father, who had written to say that his arthritis was improving and that he'd never been prouder of his daughter. Beside her, Colt worked on ranch correspondence, occasionally pausing to share an amusing detail or ask her opinion on some business matter. "Any regrets?" he asked quietly, as if reading her thoughts. Lily considered the question seriously, as she always did when he asked it. "About Thomas, about the humiliation, about having my dreams shattered in front of half the territory. Any of it." She looked out across the land that was now hers as much as his, at the garden that flourished under her care, at the life they were building together based on mutual respect and genuine love. "None," she said finally. "If I hadn't fallen that day, I never would have discovered I could stand back up on my own." In the distance, a meadowlark sang its liquid song, and Lily Mae Danner smiled, knowing that her story, their story, was just beginning.